I recently had a few arguments. One, of course, was a friend who had sent me a conversation that she obviously had with a particular individual. And then just recently I had a very similar argument. It's the usual anti-capitalist nonsense. And I decided, well, since I had a very similar argument, I would just obviously get straight down to this, obviously responding on this in particular. So, this anti-capitalist mentality is just something so common. It doesn't, like I've said before, it doesn't just exist with that of Marxists, in other words, socialists. It exists throughout society today. I seen a post earlier on, and it was by GB News, and it was something about pubs being closed down and all sorts. And there's fewer pubs today, and there's obviously the inflationary crisis and all sorts that's influencing that. And I basically passed on the comment, well, you're starting to see the fruits of the wonderful mixed economy, because that's essentially the problem. The problem is the fact that a mixed economy is financed off of borrowing what didn't exist in the first place. That is to say, creating money out of thin air, which is creating the currency out of thin air, and basically financing an economy that you could never afford to begin with. And eventually down the road you're going to face a severe economic crisis, because that's the true face of a mixed economy. It's not sustainable in the long term, and therefore my argument against the mixed economy isn't just one from some sort of biased perspective. It's from understanding economics. It's from understanding that what you're basically financing the economy with is basically money you didn't have to begin with. You can see that from the social security, in fact, because the social security system is a Ponzi scheme. Of course, not a lot of people are aware of that, but it's basically something that is being financed off of borrowing because they could never afford it to begin with, and that's the very reason why the real UK debt level is 9.6 plus trillion, pounds in debt, and a large part of that is all down to all the unpaid pensions, etc. That's what's basically making up a large part of the debt. Of course, not a lot of people are aware of that. They think it's only about like 2.3 trillion pounds. So I'm just going to move straight on to the argument that obviously a friend had, and I decided to touch upon in response to this because at the end of the day, it's very similar to this argument I'm having recently, and therefore I decided it would be best to respond in that in particular. Yeah, so I can obviously see a few comments, and thank you for obviously your comments, and I will get around to very shortly. So yeah, guys, I will of course get around to your comments very soon. I'm just going to go into this conversation because I want to kind of stay on topic. So basically, all it is basically a friend had a very similar argument, right? It's the usual anti-capitalist mentality, the one where they say, well, if it wasn't for government, where would we be? And yet there it is today. You're seeing the crisis of the economy. Of course, socialists will erroneously try to tell you that it's the fault of capitalism, but it really isn't, because, well, you're not living under a capitalist system, you're living under a mixed economy, and there's so much to go into in that. So let's just move straight on to in fact, let me see if I can dig it up for you guys, and I can actually bring the comment up on screen if I can. I will try that for you. I'm pretty sure I can. I don't know if it'll be in order. Yeah, it's going to be a bit difficult. because I don't know if it's orderly. That's the only problem. See, this is the issue in particular. We'll touch upon 1 and 2 first, because I feel they're the most important. What I'm doing at the moment, I'm just renaming so I can show them on here. It's only going to take odd seconds if I can. That's one of them though. It's not going to take long. I do apologise, guys. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that in this type of argument, it's just as farcical. Right, I don't know if they're going to be in order. It's going to be a bit hectic, so if it's a bit disorderly, the argument's still going to be the same. I don't really need to keep the conversation in order, shall I say. So let's just get straight on to it. Right. What I'll do is I'll upload the first image and you'll be able to see. Right. This was by a guy called Michael or something. Well, he was a friend of hers. And he says, when something is owned by a private individual, they can change what they want for it. They can charge what they want for it. Let's touch upon that first and foremost. No, they can't. See, any socialist that tells you, or any mixed economy sympathiser, and if they honestly tell you that a business can charge whatever they like, they know nothing about the real world of economics, and they really know nothing about prices, because there is a drop-off point. There is only so much you can charge people. It is true to say that depending on what you sell, you've got a certain niche and a certain target market. Let me give you an example of a niche and a target market. There's a company, a restaurant in New York that sells $2,000 gold pizzas. Now they're obviously selling that to people who have got money, so it's a specific niche, right? That's why they can get away with that. But in the real world of economics and business, the reality is you're only going to be able to sell for what people are willing to pay for, right? That's it. See, if nobody's willing to pay for a $2,000 gold pizza, you're faced with the economic reality that you've got no other choice but to greatly reduce your prices. It's that simple. It's just common sense should tell you that. So that's the first thing. He thinks that, businesses can just charge whatever price they like. No. That's not why companies like Apple get away with selling their computers for £2,000, £3,000 odd pounds, etc. It's not why Canon and Nikon, etc. get away with selling cameras for £4,000 when they first, come out. It's because in the laws of supply and demand as well, of course, and the reality that they do have willing customers who are willing to pay for that. For whatever reason being, I mean, that's just the reality. So because they've got a willing consumer base, then they're able to charge that. However, and this is the point, if a company was to overcharge beyond what people see as valuable to them, so let me give you an example. Someone could have a specific value for something, but they might not see the price equal to that. So they might look at the price and think to themselves, well, there's no way I can, there's no way I can basically justify paying this amount for this, product. This product is nowhere near the quality to justify me paying that amount, therefore I'm not going to pay for it, so your demand drops. That's the reality. You're always going to have a drop in demand once you reach a certain point. So that's the point that I'm obviously addressing. It's not really a case that you can just charge whatever you like. That isn't how the real world of business operates. Anybody who says that is economically illiterate and business illiterate. And I must say, economics is not a study about how you run business, nor is economics a study about finances, and it's not about the stock market. Although those things are part of an economy, it's not economics. But even from the business sense, he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the real world, that where price derives from is first of all to do with consumers' demand, what you are willing to pay for something. Because if you don't have a willing consumer base that you're going to try and sell to, you've got no choice but to reduce your prices. It's just, why else do you think you see companies with goods that they may have goods that are not selling on the shelves, therefore they're forced to reduce their prices, which is basically telling you, yes, the consumer is king. It's anybody who thinks otherwise are rather quite strange. So he goes on and he says they can reduce the supply and increase the price for the purpose of maximising profit. Right, here's the problem with that argument. This is to do with the laws of supply and demand first and foremost, if you don't understand. The reality is, the only way that you can, greatly increase the price, etc., and do so, and what he's referring to, if you don't understand, he's basing this on a false assumption that they hold this sort of monopoly, right? Which is bull. Just bull, right? He's basing it on the idea that there's no competition, they can just restrict the productive output, and therefore it's going to increase the price. Because after all, what are prices? Well, I've explained before, prices are signals. Higher prices in the market signify a shortage. It means that demand from consumers far exceeds the quantity available in supply. So if demand is far greater than the supply, the price goes up. If the supply is far greater than the demand, the price goes down. It's just basic economics, it's the laws of supply and demand. So he's basing this false assumption that such a company can simply just restrict the productive output and can get away with that, but he ignores the fact that they've got competition on their back. He also ignores that you've got business reputation to take into account, which again is something that these socialists persistently, and even if he's not a socialist, he's probably a mixed economy supporter, he seems to think business reputation is just something you can just, bat aside and pretend it just doesn't even exist. So when he says relative to this to do with, restricting the productive output of the supply and increasing the price, that's what happens. When you restrict the productive output, price goes up. Especially if demand is far greater than what's available, if there is demand there, so to speak. And therefore the price naturally goes up, right? And he says, all for the purpose of maximising profit. Well, where's the guarantee of that? Where's the guarantee that you're going to maximise your profits from doing so? There isn't a guarantee. Because, let's say for argument's sake, the company ends up restricting productive output and charging much more than that of their competition. Well, the reality is, if people can get the same thing for cheaper elsewhere, they will do so. It's not necessarily the case, however, if, let me give you an example. It was kind of like what Shane Killian gave as an example to say, when you compare McDonald's burgers to Burger King's burgers, they're two different kinds. And even if McDonald's were to reduce their prices, it's not going to affect Burger King charging a higher price. Again, it's all down to what consumers are willing to pay for and difference. However, if it's something where you're speaking about products are the same, let's say you're talking about the exact same product, or whatever it may be in particular, consumers will shop around for the cheaper cost. And if they can get cheaper from elsewhere in another company, they will do so, right? He's basing this on the false assumption again that there's no competition, right? And he's talking about about maximising profits. So this is the issue. If you're up against competition and you are going to restrict your productive output to drive your prices up to shaft the consumer, you better be prepared. In other words, you need to be someone who is able to provide quality service, better service than your competition, to justify the higher price, is what I'm saying. Because if you cannot justify the higher price, because sometimes people will pay the higher price because they trust a company, and again, this is what it all boils down to, and it all goes back to the point of business reputation. You notice how these mixed economy sympathisers, these Marxists, etc., they never ever touch upon business reputation. It's almost as if it doesn't exist to them. But the reality is, business reputation does exist. And the reason why business reputation is so important is because your success hinders upon that. It reminds me of kind of like that company, I think it's that taxi company, I can't remember their specific name in particular, but they became very popular because they stylised their sort of business around very similar to what you would do on eBay. And on eBay, buyers and sellers, the sellers in particular would have a reputation, a star rating, and that's how people would determine, well, this is who we can trust and this is who we don't, right? Reputation is very important. It's always very, very important for how you run business, how successful your business is going to be. And sometimes consumers will be willing to pay more, even if they know it's going to cost them more out of their pocket. Sometimes consumers are willing to pay more for something in a particular business because of the fact they trust that business. In other words, they wouldn't trust getting that particular product from a company they don't know, even if the product may be cheaper. Again, reputation is so important in that aspect, which again is something that these type of people completely ignore. So he's saying about that of the purpose of maximising profit. So again, it's not necessarily the case, right? For all you know, they could end up restricting the productive output, and if their quality of service is not up to scratch, if their reputation is very poor, they will lose customers. And if this person has studied business, he will understand the very fact that consumers, like wildfire, will spread the bad word, and the bad word spreads like wildfire. It's like lighting a match. You light one tree and the rest catches on fire, and therefore the bad reputation spreads like crazy. And they end up losing customers as a result of that to their competition, right? So again, that's why this type of person purposely leaves out reputation. He thinks it's just a case that businesses can just do whatever the hell they like, in other words. He then says capitalism is a contradiction. That's just a baseless claim. How's that a contradiction? What's a contradiction about capitalism? Strange. He says a religion. Well, no, it's not. It's based on human nature. It's not an ideology. It's based on something that is something that we can provide historical proof for its success. There's much evidence to show for capitalism. Hong Kong, Singapore, Sweden between 1870 to 1960, etc., etc. We can turn to examples to show for the success. So it's certainly not a religion. We've got history there to back it, and we've got the study of economics to back the evidence. For example, the damage that is created by socialism, by fixing prices above or below market value, being faced with the economic calculation problem, that's an argument that justifies capitalism. In other words, leaving prices be to the market. It's not like we haven't got the evidence, we do. He then says the goal is to maximise profit. What he doesn't tell you, because he's just spouting these wee fancy things he doesn't really comprehend. In a capitalist system, and we're talking about that of a free market economy, the only way that you can sell goods and make a profit to begin with is by benefiting the consumer. That's it. If you're not going to benefit the consumer, your goods aren't going to sell. Sorry, that's the real world of capitalism. Therefore, your business is not going to be successful. You can then say with all these scenarios and make things up out of thin air and say all the what ifs about, stuff like, well, what if some capitalist created a business and, falsely advertised and then gave consumers products that they didn't want, and maybe it was a dangerous product and it cost them their lives, and it's like, it's so dangerous and the consumers can't do anything about it. Again, that is ignoring business reputation. You honestly think for 1 second that a business can just take products, produce whatever the hell they like, put it out there in the market, and that guarantees that it sells? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. That doesn't guarantee anything. And do you honestly believe for 1 second, in the absence of government regulation, that businesses can just simply produce dangerous products, put it out there on the shelves, and the consumer can do nothing about it? You honestly think that's how things operate? You think if it wasn't for government regulation that, companies can just do whatever the hell they like? Really? That's rather quite interesting. And why is that a problem? Why is that entire argument a problem? Simple. Because in a free market economy, in other words a capitalist system, individuals' rights are protected. If an individual is harmed from another individual or another company or whatever it may be, that individual can hold them to account and can take them to court. Now, And a similar argument to this particular individual. A similar argument someone stated where they said, well, the company can just make things up as they go along. Well, that isn't the real world, because we had history there in the 19th century to show for what happened to those particular companies. I will say, however, there is no such thing as perfection. You'll always have corruption and you will always have exploitation. It's always going to exist to some extent. But when you compare that of a mixed economy or socialism to the full extent to that of a free market, the level of corruption is greatly reduced in a free market in comparison to what you have today. Besides the point is that what he's basically trying to speak about in terms of, the maximising the profits, etc., he doesn't understand that profits is something that's only going to be made if you provide quality service. And your business reputation does hinder on that. It does. Do not tell me that business reputation is not important. Oh yes, it is. And I gave a similar example of this in an example to do with safety in the workplace. In other words, we've got American history to prove beyond all reason of a doubt that destroys all British mixed economy supporters whenever they say, oh, if it wasn't for government and its safety regulations. Oh really? The government regulatory body of safety in the workplace in the United States did not come around until 1970. And why is that important? Because like I said before, folk, for more than a century and a half long period, throughout the entire 19th century, leading all the way through the 20th century, right up to 1970, when the Occupation for Health and Safety Administration stepped in, the OHSA, which is basically the government regulatory body for safety regulations in the United States. Before the government's regulations stepped in, the death toll in the American workplace, as well of course the workplace injuries, were falling year in, year out. Every year, every decade, the workplace was becoming safer in the absence of government's regulations. However, when the OHSA stepped in, which is the government regulatory body, as soon as they stepped in 1970, workplace injuries fell stagnant and has been stagnant ever since 1970. In other words, the very fact that the workplace injuries was falling for decade after decade prior to that, for more than a century long period, is living proof that government's regulation did not make the workplace safer. It's proof beyond all reason of a doubt that all government's regulation did was made things worse off and slowed the process down and caused harm. That's what it did. However, in relation to what he's basically stated here about maximising profits, because he's about to go on and say about this to do with the stuff about, oh, they can pay out as much wages as they freely like, they can do whatever the hell they like, they can take shortcuts, they can do dangerous things. Again, as his entire argument doesn't look at business reputation. So, let me give you that example in correlation to what I just explained there. The reason why the American workplace was getting safer year in, year out without the government's regulation was because of two things. One, business reputation, and two, competition. In other words, it is true to say that yes, in order for you to maximise your profits, you must minimise your costs. And yes, it is true to say that if you reduce workers' wages, it will cost you less, and therefore you can maximise your profits. I know I'll get around to the wages argument in a second, after I explain this. It is true to say all of that. But again, business reputation is important, right? So, the reality is, it would cost a business very dearly if it was very dangerous, if their business was dangerous, because they would have to pay out, compensation first and foremost for people who are temporarily out of work that might have been injured or whatever due to what's happened in the workplace, and therefore a dangerous workplace is going to be very costly for them. So they will, find ways to improve the safety of the workplace as a result of that, because they don't want to be faced with that position. So in order for them to maximise their profits, they're going to have to fix those issues to prevent future injuries from happening, etc., etc. And you saw this in the Industrial Revolution, where technology would improve, the machines would improve, and therefore things would, over a period of time gradually become safer as years rolled on. And so that's why they were enticed to improve the safety, because the whole goal of making a profit, of maximising profits, incentivised them to do so. Because not only do profits provide you information of basically the most efficient methods of production, it provides you the information of, what you're doing right in the market, as well, of course. Your losses is just as important, telling you what you're doing wrong. And so that's the whole thing, right? The other point to make just quickly on top of that, it would also cost a business for being dangerous a wage premium. That's why when you look at industries today, I don't know what type of industry you might think of. Maybe it's an electrician, whatever industry it may be. Any industry that is dangerous is forced to pay out massive amount of wages, because that's the reality of it. You're paying a wage premium. So if the goal is to maximise the profits and minimise the costs, how then do they prevent themselves from, having to pay out wage premiums? They improve the safety of the workplace. So that's an example of how important profits are. It's an incentive, in other words, an incentive to improve the safety of your workplace. So in other words, it was through competition and business reputation that improved the safety of the workplace, not because of government's regulation. And as I explained earlier, the evidence proved that. Now, you might say, well, of course, they can pay out any wages they like then, they can just, in order to maximise the profits, and they can just pay out whatever wages they like then. That isn't the reality, because again, competition would then come into it. And again, we'll go on to that. So this is more or less the point that he was getting on to. Because he then says, by keeping wages as low as possible whilst getting workers to produce as much as possible. Well, again, that argument is deeply flawed. Because not only is he ignoring the fact that business reputation exists, he is ignoring the fact that in the real world, you've got competition up against you. And he's basing workers as if it's just one fixed term. Workers is not just one fixed group. You don't just have workers. And you have to laugh at these people because they're so infantile. They think that chief executive officers are somehow not workers, as if they just kick their feet up and do nothing. That's the type of infantile-minded, people you're dealing with when you come across these type of arguments. They don't even begin to understand how hard these business owners went through for the creation of their business, the risks that they had to take, especially the financial risks that they had to take in order to get their business running, especially in the face of all that government regulation and the taxation, etc., etc. So the point he's making that they can just, reduce the wages, and he bases workers as if it's just one group. Well, why is it not just one group? Why is saying workers irrational? Because not all workers are at the same level. You've got skilled workers, and then you've got people who don't really have the experience. They're not the same. You cannot compare a skilled worker to that of someone who has no experience and doesn't have the necessary skills. How can you even conflate the two as if they're the same thing? Anybody who does that's irrational, right? So that's the point. Yes, there is a very, very large abundance of unskilled labour, right? And therefore, that's why their wages are, not so great. That's why entry-level jobs, such as your retail companies, and this is the problem, these people don't, and this is why they end up supporting things like the minimum wage, etc., because they don't understand economics. They don't really understand that these type of jobs were not meant to pay you $15 an hour or £15 an hour, etc. They're entry-level jobs. They're not supposed to pay you that amount, right? They're basically jobs there that you can get your foot in the door and then move up the ladder, right? Later down the line, to gain experience, to gain necessary skills, etc., etc., so you can move up the ladder, right? So that's quite an important point, because workers are not the same. It's not just like one group. You've got skilled labour and you've got those who are not skilled, those who may lack experience. And in the reality, in the real world, skilled labour is something highly sought for. In other words, there is very, very high demand for skilled labour. And the demand far exceeds the quantity and supply available. And not just in recorded history we saw this, but it was because of the competitive labour market that drove wages up. Again, I've touched upon this before, and I even stated that during the first industrial revolution, even in Great Britain, wages drove up. Between 1780 to 1820, it drove up by 0.55% per year. Now that might sound like nothing, however, that was unprecedented wage growth to them, because prior to that they had nothing, right? And then between 1820 to 1850, it was growing on average by 1.2% per year. In other words, the wage growth was occurring because of a competitive labour market, not because of government. And it contradicts their narrative, because they love to paint the first industrial revolution as the period that collapsed because, in the absence of government, this is what happened, the standards of living collapsed, etc. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. That was one of the main claims that they made about the Industrial Revolution, folk. They made one of the biggest myths, claiming that, there was a collapse of living standards. It was even written by so-called historians, and they went as far as to say that, the wages, in other words, the poor get poorer. and the rich get richer. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm not going to go into that, but the point being, that historical example and the proof of what we saw of wage growth, the rich actually got richer, and the poor, by the masses, got richer. They were getting much greater wages by the 1840s compared to what they were, 50 years prior to that period. Sure, it was a slow wage growth. It doesn't matter. The point being, you saw, as a result of the competitive labour market, wages driving up. And again, it was the same story in the United States of America, where, during the first and into the second industrial revolution, you saw a real wage earning growth rate on average per year growing by 1.6% per year. So wages were improving, and we've even got a concession by Richard Wolff, of all people. If you don't know who Richard Wolff is, he's a communist. The very fact a communist even went as far as to concede and said that, as a result of capitalism, wages were growing from the 1840s right up to 1970s. That's a very big concession. That's coming from someone who is a Marxist. Okay? A very big concession. So, it's not a case of what he's trying to claim. Because he's basically, he's saying that, workers are all the same. And he's also saying that business reputation is just, he's pretty much, kidding on, it doesn't even exist. As if a business can just do whatever they like. They can just pay out whatever they like. They can just pay out dirt poor wages and they can't do anything about it. Well, if that was the case, then during the period of the wage growth that was occurring throughout the Industrial Revolution, why didn't they pay them less than that then? Why didn't they? Why were they continually paying, the better wages over a period of time? And I'm not saying exploitation doesn't exist. It does exist. And that's the harsh reality. You will get companies that will try that, and you'll never get rid of that 100%. It's just reality. Again, anybody that believes otherwise does not live in the real world. You generally tend to find that these people who make these arguments really don't live in the real world. And especially when it comes to people who support the mixed economy, they laughably, say all this stuff about capitalism, but here they are living in a mixed economy where corruption, exploitation, and all of these monopolies and oligopolies and cartels, it's rife. It's rife. And they constantly contradict themselves, and you'll see his argument goes on. So anyway, he's basically saying that they can just pay out as, whatever they like, but the reality is your business reputation again comes into it, and due to fierce competition, well, if you've got competition up against you, if competition is willing to pay out more in wages, well, you're going to end up losing your workers to your competitors. And again, it all goes back to that point that I made on the competitive skilled labour market. Competition has to compete for skilled labour. And since the demand for skilled labour is greater than the supply of skilled labour available, their wages go up. Right? That's the reality. Right? It's throughout history, that's been the case. Their wages have gone up and the price of everything was going down. In fact, like I said before, between 1840 to 1900, the consumer price index was continuously falling across the entire economy. The United States of America was going through a deflationary period. It was deflationary because the quantity of money was... Well, at that time you had gold and it was the gold standard from 1834 that became the dominant standard, and there was deflation. It's the opposite of inflation. Inflation simply means the contraction of the monetary supply. So the more and more that you print of the money, the currency, the paper currency, the greater the inflation. Well, deflation's the opposite of that. And as a result of that, the consumer prices were falling, etc. And another reason why this period of history between 1840 to 1900 in the United States of America, why it contradicts his kind, is because this was the period of the myth of the robber barons. That's right, I said myth. And like I said before, the reason it's a myth is because the likes of John Davison Rockefeller and Cornelius Vanderbilt did not hold monopolies. And just quickly, a monopoly by definition, when you think of the word mono, it means singular. It means that you would own the market 100%. That's it, 100% what it means. This is exactly what a monopoly means. If you try to define monopoly as anything else, then you're basically bastardizing its definition. A monopoly means that you own the market 100%, not 90%. You own the market 100% where there's no competition whatsoever, and you drive the prices up to shaft the consumer. That's the definition of a monopoly. That's what a monopoly is, right? In fact, that was the main reason why people feared a monopoly. They said that, the likes of Rockefeller drove the prices up and shafted the consumer, etc. But the reality was, truth said otherwise. Instead, what you saw was, in that period of the late 19th century, the likes of Rockefeller, etc., the level of productive output increased dramatically. Again, when you turn back to his earlier point where he said, well, they would restrict the productive output and, they would drive the prices up because they were evil monopolists. Well, that's rather quite funny, because the oil refinery market that John Davison Rockefeller was in, and he was accused of holding a monopoly. After all, he was the one who owned Standard Oil. In 1869, it would cost more than 30 cents a barrel of oil, but by 1885, although holding 90% share of the market, the price of a barrel of oil had dropped so much that it only cost 8.5 cents a barrel of oil. Remember, more than 30 cents a barrel of oil in 1869, all the way down to 8.5 cents a barrel of oil, right? By 1885. Which is proof that in order for that price to have dropped, and even when he held 90% share of the market, he would have had to have increased the productive output, which he did. And the reason why he did was because he had competition on his back, right? He didn't have a monopoly. One of his main competitors was the producer and seller of the electric light bulb. Plus, he had many oil refinery companies elsewhere in Europe who were in competition with one of, I think one of them was Sun Oil Company or something like that. I can't specifically remember, but he had many competitors on his back, many big competitors, and as a result of having competition, of course, especially someone who's produced the electric light bulb, well, what was oil refinery, what was kerosene used for at that time? Well, kerosene, part of it he used for, people selling to people for them to light their homes, right? It was, revolutionary at that time. But as soon as the electric light bulb came around, just as capitalism always does, it finds a better solution. Competition ends up, producing and innovating something more efficient. And if the electric light bulb comes around and other things that are more efficient, then of course it's going to force them to continue on driving down the costs. So, it's just one of these things that it contradicts the narrative to say, well, he had the luxury to reduce the productive output. No, he never. And you have to ask the question, why not? Well, the answer is rather quite simple, because you wouldn't benefit from it. I mean, could you imagine John Davis and Rockefeller restricting his productive output and driving the price up, only to have his arse handed to him by his competition, who would charge less? Again, the only way a company would get away with charging at a higher price up against competition is if they're providing a better quality service. That's it, right? In other words, you have to benefit your consumers. So what I'm explaining to you, things are not black and white. Things are not simple. It's not as simple as what he's trying to make out to be within the business, within economics. It's not as simple as what he's trying to paint things to be. So he says, so is that economics? And then he says, you've studied economics. And this is obviously him responding to a friend of mine. He says, you've studied economics, so now you must know that one of the central goals of economics is to achieve equilibrium. But the goal of capitalism is in direct opposition to the achievement of equilibrium. These people have got, the obsession over this entire argument, right? They really do have the obsession. He then goes on and says, the more successful a capitalist company is at maximising profit, the less purchasing power workers have. The purchasing power. Again, this is contradicted. The purchasing power is to do with the power, the purchasing power of your monetary value, right? The purchasing power, when you drive down the purchasing power of your monetary value, then it's going to harm, people in general. He's talking about, if consumers are if employees are getting paid poorer wages, are not getting paid enough, then they will somehow struggle. But like I just explained, and it's why I just explained that there, like I just explained about the period between 1840 to 1900, thanks to capitalism, you saw a deflationary period. So in other words, since the consumer price index was continuously falling and wages were driving up, that's a contradiction of everything he's just stated there. Because not only was that the period of the myth of the robber barons, it was a period where not only did wages go up, you saw the purchasing power of the monetary value going up as the quantity of the monetary supply was in shortage. So in other words, the value of the money was going up, and even if companies were paying out poorer wages and what have you, they were still better off than what they were before because of the falling consumer prices. Their life was a whole lot better off. That wasn't the reason why, because these people, and this is the problem, I've explained this before, and I don't want to go into a full-blown argument because you could go into this extensively in of itself, but these are the type of people that look at the Industrial Revolution and they basically say, by comparing today's wages to wages back then and saying, oh, look how poor their wages are. That's an irrational argument. If you want to measure what progress is, you have to look at what life was like before the Industrial Revolution to that period in of itself. You don't measure progress by looking at today's wages and then stupidly looking at the Industrial Revolution and saying, oh, look how poor their wages were. And that's exactly what he is doing. It's exactly what he's doing. Because in other words, the wages to us was dirt poor. They don't understand the reason for why these strikes occurred. You take, for example, the famous example of the Pinkertons, and there was the strikers, and the strikers, went out and protest because, the poor wages, etc., etc. Just like the Mises Institute had rightly explained, the very reason for why there was a demand for higher paid wages was because of the growth of the wages to begin with. Because it was unprecedented. Think about it this way. Why was there no strikes before the Industrial Revolution? Why was there no strikes? The answer is simple. Because everybody was dirt poor. Everybody was, extremely dirt poor wages. They were getting paid substantially less in the farms than they ever did in the factories. That's an historical fact. Wage growth was unprecedented in the first Industrial Revolution. So, it wasn't so much to do with the fact that, the wages were dirt poor, that's why they were out striking. It's actually because the wage growth was slow and they grew frustrated from the experience of the growth. That obviously they grew frustrated from that experience because they had a taste of improvement of life, and of course they've grown frustrated at the slow growth over a period of time. But even if it's slow growth, it's still growth of wages. Their wages have still been driving up. So in other words, they would not have had that frustration had there been no wage growth at all. Does that make sense to you? Had it been like, if there was no Industrial Revolution and life remained stagnant like it was before the Industrial Revolution, there would have been no demand for higher paid wages. There would be no demand for, these strikes. There would be no strikes at all because there was no growth. So in other words, the only reason why the strikes came about was because of the growth, not because of something else. It was because of the growth. So that's the point he doesn't understand. He thinks it's just a case that, they would just pay out whatever the hell they like and that's it. Rubbish. Nonsense. The wages were driving up and they were getting frustrated from the slow growth. But like I said, if there was no growth whatsoever and there was no Industrial Revolution, where would the strikes be then? They wouldn't be there. Because they wouldn't have experienced improvement of their life and wages to have such a feeling to, a desire to improve. Right? So that's why it is deeply flawed for anybody to compare today's wages to a period like the 1870s, for example. It's irrational. If you want to measure progress, you look at what life was like before then to that period, not after then to that period. And so, I think I read that part. He says, but the goal of capitalist director is achieving the more successful a capitalist company is maximising profit, the less purchasing power workers have. He says, that's why we now have central banks and print money. Now this comment is arguably the most ignorant-minded comment. And this is someone, I think, who supports the mixed economy, by the way. This is amusing, right? This is really amusing. He thinks that the introduction of central banks and the printing of the fiat currency. If you don't know what a fiat currency means, it basically means it was fiat to a certain extent in the United States until the petrodollar came around. But however, fiat basically means that gold was stripped away from it and there was nothing backing it, right? And in other words, they were printing the currency out of thin air. He's basically trying to say there, I'll just read it again, he says, that's why we now have central banks and print money. So basically what I'm gathering from what he's basically trying to say, he's trying to say that it was a positive thing that you had central banks and began printing money to fix this problem. In other words, in plain English, he is a Keynesian. In plain English, he supports the mixed economy. But what he doesn't understand, and how you can tell mixed economy sympathisers do not understand basic economics, in other words, just to put this in simpleton's language for you, right? Anybody who opposes a free market economy are economically illiterate. That is to say that if anybody supports the mixed economy or Marxism, haven't got a clue about economics. I'm just saying that. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. It's based on economics, it's based on, history. We've got evidence to show for it. You're seeing it today. It's why you're in this mess today. You're living in the absence of a free market. This is the true state of a mixed economy. All a mixed economy is a slower decline to that of your eventual ending. That's it. Right? It's basically it's like you sitting in a motor with your foot down in the pedal, right? And communism, as an example, is putting your foot right down on the pedal and you're heading for the cliff edge. Well, all a mixed economy is, because it's the mixture between capitalism and socialism, is all you've done is just taken your foot slightly about 45 degrees upwards or whatever. I don't particularly, I don't drive yet, so I don't bloody well know, right? I don't know where the bloody well pedal is. I don't know if it sits like that or whatever. Anyway, I'm just imagining they take their foot off the pedal just gradually to a point where you're still going forward, you're still moving towards the cliff edge. You're just going at a slower pace rate. That's the mixed economy. That's essentially it. There's no such thing as a sustainable mixed economy in the long term. And the sad reality is most people in society support the mixed economy, right? Because they've been brainwashed into believing that, if you go too much in the extreme of either end of capitalism or socialism, then all hell breaks loose. Because they've been brainwashed their entire life about all the myths about the 19th century, fed myths about monopolies under capitalism and all the rest of this. It's the usual nonsense. It's why they protect themselves from a pro-capitalist system. Right? In other words, people who support the mixed economy are really like the dog that chases its own tail, running in circles. Right? It's as simple as that. So, what he's basically trying to say here, he's saying that it's a positive thing that you've got these central banks and you're printing the currency. Right? As if that was somehow a solution to fix the problem of, government came in and saved your day. So why is that a problem with his entire argument? And why does it prove he's economically illiterate? Money is no exception to the laws of supply and demand. It's just like if you stood in the middle of the Sahara Desert and all you had was one bottle of water. How valuable is every drop of that water in that bottle? If you're standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert and every direction you turn to, every direction you look in, you've got miles and miles and miles to walk in order to reach safety. in order for you to safely, reach where you can get more water or whatever for the sake of survival. And you're in the sweltering heat in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and all you've got is one bottle of water. Well, how valuable do you think every drop of that is worth to your entire life? It's worth everything. However, if you stood in the middle of Scotland, filled with crystal clear rivers, streams and waterfalls and, all sorts, and you're in the middle of Glencoe, you're in the middle of Scotland, in the middle of bloody well nowhere, what value is that same bottle of water worth to your life then? I can simply tell you it's worth nothing. Because you can easily pour the bottle of water out and you can refill the bottle of water through a stream running down the side of a mountain. I would know because I did exactly that on Ben Nevis, Britain's tallest mountain. Right, so that's the point. The laws of supply and demand. The greater the supply you have of something, the less demand you have for it, therefore the lower the price. Whereas the less you have of something in supply available, and the greater demand you have for it, the greater the price is going to be, the higher the price is going to be. That's why I say to people that whenever they see higher prices in the market, that is signifying a shortage. It's not something made up. It's basic economics. That's how I can tell you for a fact, and not an opinion, that Scandinavian economies are unsustainable. That's how I can tell you that just by looking at their domestic costs of living, that all the prices of their food and all sorts is through the roof. Why is that? Because of their higher tax rates. Because they can't afford to produce in their own home country. So prices are signals. Prices don't just, sit there for nothing. That's how we can tell that information. And so, the laws of supply and demand applies to all of your productivity. And it's the same principle with that of money. Money is no exception to the laws of supply and demand. So in other words, the less you have of that money available in quantity of supply, and greater demand you have for it, the purchasing power of your money drives up. The stronger the purchasing power of your money holds, the richer you are as a society. Right? The richer you are as a society. When you increase the quantity of the monetary supply, and the monetary supply continues to, increase in quantity, and this is exactly why paper currency was dangerous, was irrational, was corrupt, was a disaster. It's because paper can be printed, gold and silver cannot. Gold and silver is harder to obtain because you have to dig it physically out of the ground, and there's only so much of it available. That's why for thousands of years, gold and silver was something intrinsic that held its value despite thousands of years. Paper did not. When they increased the quantity of the paper printed, because after all, paper can be printed, when they increased the quantity of the paper printed in circulation, it was devaluing the purchasing power of your currency. The lower the purchasing power of your currency, the less you can buy with it. The poorer you are as a result of that, because the less you can buy with it. It is important, and like I've stated numerous times before, wealth is not how much money you hold. In other words, if wealth was all about how much money you hold, well, Venezuelan people would be stinking filthy rich. And you could make everybody rich by simply, printing $1 billion for every household across the country if that was the case. But the reality is, wealth is not how much money you hold. And it's not how much money you earn in wages. And this is the point that socialists and all mixed economy sympathisers don't understand. Just like the argument that I was giving there, for example, about the company, maybe in the late 19th century, where, okay, wages were going up, but maybe in his argument, they would pay out poorer wages, but he's ignoring the consumer price index was going down. So in other words, they were actually getting richer because they could buy more with it. Do you understand? Wealth is to do with, with how much you can buy with it. The very fact that the purchasing power was going up and there was a deflationary period is evidence for that. It's not even debatable, it's a fact. It's as factual as the moon exists. And that the earth is a globe. And yes, a globe means it's round. But that's the point. So, in his argument, he doesn't acknowledge the very fact that paper is something that can be printed, and as a result of that, the disastrous consequences on our lives, on our economy, was the very fact that not only could it be printed, they did print it. And they printed more and more of it. And to simplify it in relation to the laws of supply and demand, the more and more and more of that paper you hold in circulation of the economy, in other words, the more and more they print of it, the less scarce the paper becomes. And therefore the less demand you've got for it. Because after all, there's so much of the paper, what's its real worth then? It's not really worth anything. There's so much of it in circulation. So what ends up happening is the purchasing power drives down so much, you end up reaching a certain point, which I think is like 10% inflation, which that's exactly what inflation means. Don't let anybody tell you what in other words, do not let anybody tell you that inflation means something else other than that. That is inflation. That is 100% accurate to what inflation means. Inflation, like the inflating the size of a balloon, it's the increase of the quantity of the paper, not just paper, but money. The increase of the monetary supply made available. And it just so happens to be that through the printing press, they were doing just that. So, in 1913, and I showed this before to you guys, I don't know if I can show I do apologise. It's not that one. No. I'll try and find the one for you. No. I do apologise. I'll try and there it is. Right. You can roughly see. I'll just resize it a bit. You can roughly see from here, folk, right? From here, 1913, right? I'll get this thing out of the way, just so you can see better. Okay. Right. You can see here from the graph that I'm showing, in 1913, $1 was equal to basically the value of one product. And that's what it is, right? It's every $1 equal to the value of one product. Right? So, for every $1 or £1 printed in circulation, you're basically adding 1 plus debt to the currency. the more and more of that paper there is printed, the more of that paper there is chasing the goods. So there's, for every $1 printed, there's more of that paper than there is of that of the good itself. That's the reason why the currency devaluation occurred, and that is essentially what inflation is. In other words, inflation is the devaluation of the purchasing power of your currency, so that the less it holds, the less you can buy with it. That's the very reason why, in 1970s in the United States of America, you could buy a Big Mac meal from McDonald's for about 70 cents. Or probably less than that. 70 cents. I don't know what the prices are in the United States today. I would imagine that paying for a Big Mac meal in the United States would probably cost you upwards to about $5 to $8. I would imagine that, due to inflation. But that's essentially what inflation simply means. Okay? So, that's how you can tell that he is economically illiterate. Because he's trying to say that it's a positive thing. That it's positive. He says, because we'll read that section again. He says, the more successful a capitalist company is at maximising profit, the less purchasing power workers have. That's why we now have central banks and print money. So in other words, he's trying to say that in order to fix the very problem with the issue to do with, to do with people getting paid dirt poor wages, apparently. Again, he's contradicted by history, as I say. Real world history of American history especially contradicts him. But when he says that, he's saying that the central banks was somehow something that fixed the problem. Really. Fixed the problem. Inflation drives your prices up. In other words, the lower the purchasing power you have of that currency, the less you can buy with it, and the cost of everything just drives up across the entire economy. And funny enough, that is precisely what you see today. You can actually find this yourself. I don't know if I can quickly find it myself. I'll leave it the now. I might do it for a future video, or I might confine this into a short particular video or whatever. But the reality is, you can go on and you can find it for yourself, that the M2 monetary supply of the United Kingdom. And in the year 2020, which should not bloody well surprise you, right? Given the fact that the economy was locked down, and you know fine well, given the fact that I've stated so many times over, that there's only two places you can get money from, the private sector taxpayer or the printing press. Given the very fact that the gold standards, we're already away from all of that, and given the very fact that the private sector was severely limited and most were closed down and during the lockdowns of 2020, how else do you think government was paying for all the furloughs? How else do you think? And this is actually relative to a recent argument. There's the talk of Boris Johnson is now giving every household £450, and people are like, yes, well done, Boris Johnson, well done, yes, Boris Johnson, that's I'm your typical conservative, well done. Where did the money come from? You raised the tax rates, that doesn't benefit your economy. Where's the money coming from? The answer is, folk, they're taking the money from you and giving some of it back to you. You'd have been better off if you had the lower tax rates. They're basically taking you for a ride. They're making a fool out of you. And they know that most people don't understand economics, so they just go along with it. But relative to that, to do with the whole thing on the lockdowns, the harsh reality was most private companies were closed down during that time period. So where was the money coming from to furlough all of that? Running the printing press. And I can show you a graph that illustrates that. And I don't have it at the moment, but I'll screenshot it when I do get a hold of it. Basically, it's a graph that shows you that in 2020, and you can look this up for yourself, the M2 monetary supply of the United Kingdom, as soon as it reaches 2020, it skyrockets. In other words, the increase of your monetary supply, that's what inflation is. Right? So your inflation has skyrocketed since 2020. And that was all the fault of doing exactly that. Now, we weren't even over the 2008 financial crisis and they had done that. Right? So see anybody who sits there and says to you that it was a positive thing and that's why we now have central banks and print money. They don't have a clue about economics. And it was actually through all the intervention that created the problems, and we'll see that as the argument goes on. He says that's the only way you can balance the... I'll find the second one for you guys. Where's the second? I'll find it. I'm pretty sure this is it. I'm positive this is it. He says that's the only way you can balance the contradiction. In other words, he's basically trying to say that's the only way that you can balance things out. Now, how's that balancing things out? That's essentially what wiped your arse with the consumers. That's what drove consumers' prices through the roof. In other words, between 1840 to 1900, with the consumer price index continuously dropping across the entire economy, just like the oil refinery industry, from 1869, when it would cost more than 30 cents a barrel of oil, was he trying to say that by 1897, that when it would only cost 5.9 cents a barrel of oil, is he honestly trying to tell you that consumers were worse off for that? Seriously? So, let's use for argument's sake, because this is a similar argument, folk. It's a bit like you driving, right? And you know how costly it is to drive today, and I don't even drive yet, but you know, I can certainly imagine what it's like for you guys. But let's just imagine for a second that tomorrow, as if by magic, the price of your petrol drops by $2. Is he trying to tell me that you would be worse off for that? How would you be? It's cheaper. It's cheaper for you to get petrol to fill your motor up if it's $2 cheaper, if it's £2 cheaper. You're better off as a result of it. So, when you're going through deflation and the price drops from more than 30 cents a barrel down to 5.9 cents a barrel, it means it's cheaper for you to light your own home. Of course, common sense would tell you that. But these people, they just don't understand. They don't get economics. They're clueless. So, the illustration I gave you of running the printing press, that drove prices up because your purchasing power's driving down, right? So in other words, all you basically did was made everything more costly on society. And then to top it off, not only as a result of the inflation, which the inflation was influenced from all this sort of stuff that you cannot afford, but the other reason for what crippled our economy, on top of all the inflation that's stemming from all of this, in other words, inflation is the direct consequence of paying for an economy that you could never afford to have. That is to say, the mixed economy. And why is that? Because social security was never something that you could afford. Never. Not even from the get-go. How they were paying for social security was through borrowing what didn't exist. Running the printing press. Driving your inflation through the roof and making your cost of living soaring through the roof. And then people wonder why I say that if we abolish social security and move towards a free market, we would be a whole lot better off. And they don't understand that because they don't get economics. They've honestly not got the slightest clue about economics. They somehow think that they're better off for, financing social security that is done through running the printing press. It's laughable. It really is. It's just like the same people who think that you're somehow better off for having your so-called free services like the NHS, etc. It's not free. All of that's being paid for by what's created out of thin air. All the borrowing. And it's eventually catching up on us. It's now getting to the breaking point. It's catching up on us. There was only so many years that you could get away with all that borrowing for. In other words, there was only so long that you could get away with kicking the can down the road with your wonderful mixed economy. It doesn't last forever. Because the reality is, money pays for everything. And there's going to become the point where your currency is going to collapse and you're not going to have the money to pay for it. And it will come to an end. It has to come to an end. It'll do so on its own because people don't want to let go of what they could never afford to begin with. And that being things like the NHS, things like the social security, things like the state-run fire department. It's all going to come to an abrupt end. The only reason why free markets can get away with, having these type of things, like for example a state-run fire department, for example, the only reason why free markets can get away with that is because free markets are strongly, privately run, and there's a lot of money coming into the country to be able to afford to be able to do so. But in a mixed economy, it's not the case, because that your expenditures is much greater than that of your income. It's just, and for whatever reason being, people seem to think it's different for a country. No, it's not. Why is it any different for a country than it is for a business? It isn't. If you're going to run a business at a loss, you're not going to last long. And it's no different with how the country's been. The reality is, financing all of this stuff that we could never afford to begin with. And because you've got a majority of people in society who live in some protective bubble where they don't want to let go of these things. They don't want to let go of it. That's the problem. Right? That is the problem. That's essentially it. People are emotionally attached and fixed to the things like the social security. Christ, you go out there into society and somebody tried to say to me, oh well, the majority, and they tried to patronise me because I said the majority of people support the mixed economy. These people don't understand that the majority of people do actually support the mixed economy. You go out there into society and you tell them that we should abolish social security and just watch the reaction that you get. People don't like the truth. And when you look at the current UK debt level, that's more than £9.6 trillion in debt, most of that debt is made up from all the unpaid pensions, etc. From basically the liabilities of bailing out the banks, etc. So the reality is, we are in this mess because of the mixed economy. And eventually, it's all going to come to an end. Because money pays for everything, and your feelings don't matter. Your feelings are worthless in the face of economic facts and economic reality. So, even if people say, well, I feel and we should, and all this, this, that, and the next thing, yeah, very good. Very good. Economics doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't care. It doesn't care what you want. It's like these people who say, I want my NHS. It's like, well, very good. You can want all you want, and you can, have the feelings all you want. But there's going to come a point where you won't be able to pay for it. And that's the very reason why in the last decade or so, you're seeing a slow change of things. But even then, even the current model of how things are done is not sustainable. And eventually that's going to have to come to an end. And people are already speaking about, alternatives. I don't need to go into that whole topic issue in of itself. But that's the reality. You're faced with this reality that you're not going to have that forever. Because the money's not going to be there. There's only so long the government can get away with all this borrowing. And it's the creditors that hold the purse strings. The creditors are going to ask for their money back. And what do you think is going to happen when those creditors raise the interest rates? Yeah. That will really cripple the government. Trust me, it will. But that's basically, he says, you can balance the contradiction. He says, we're talking basic math. It's not rocket science. It was quite amazing that someone as economically illiterate as himself would come out with such arrogance. He went on and says, that's like saying you don't agree with the earth being round. You're talking facts. That couldn't be any simpler. But, well, no. Again, it's the arrogance of these, type of people who oppose the free market. The arrogance of them, because they don't comprehend what they're even talking about to begin with. The third one, I'll just go through this quicker than before. I mean, it's just one of these things. He says, that used to be the way it was for internet and telephone, but since those things were privatised, costs went from $10 a month up to $100 a month. Again, it's one of these things in the laws of supply and demand. It really all depends. You don't have a free market economy today, so I don't know why he uses that example. And it's one of these things that, private companies are not just charging, based on one bandwidth. You have companies that charge, for different types of bandwidth. So what is the bandwidth? What's the speed that you're getting? These are things all taken into account. There's different prices available in the market. Of course, government's inefficient. But again, he's ignoring the very fact that you don't have a free market economy. Therefore, you don't have the fierce competition. And you have this issue today. And you also have the inflationary issues, etc. So, it's one of these things. You get the point of what I'm addressing. You're living in a corporatist system. And, He's basically ignoring this fact. And it's important to note that, governments that end up charging at a lower price are typically setting down price ceilings and what have you. And you know what a price ceiling results in? Shortages. Oh, by Christ. They've shown the failure on that so many times over. Just recently, we saw the nationalisation in Scotland of the railways. By Christ, it didn't take a week to see its failure. It really is amusing. It's like one big comedy show. These people just don't get it, and they never will. That's what creates shortages, basically. So the government can act as the saviour all it wants by artificially lowering the price, but that's not going to change anything. Because what a higher price in the market signifies to begin with is that demand far exceeds the available supply there is. So it serves a purpose in order to ration what is scarce. Now you imagine that relative to bandwidth. Could you imagine demand being sky high enough as it is, and therefore the price goes up in order to ration that? And then could you imagine the government taking that price and artificially driving it down? What you would end up doing to that server, because I don't understand to do with, internet and bandwidth and all the rest of it. However, one thing I do understand is traffic. Could you imagine what would happen as a result of government artificially lowering the price? What would end up happening is you would have an overload. The demand would, because it's simple, it's basic economics. When price goes down, demand goes up. So you imagine that the demand is already high enough as it is. So you imagine dropping the price, you're going to end up causing an overload. And what ends up happening as a result of that is the quality of your service goes down, because you end up getting cut off the internet more often, probably. As well, of course, your internet will probably run really, really slow as a result of that. It's one of these things that prices are there for a reason, and you've got the different bandwidths and all the rest. You get the point. Of course, he wouldn't touch upon. It's a bit like these people who support things like the NHS, etc. They never tell you the full story. They always they paint these public services as only the positives. They'll never tell you the truth of it. It's just like these people who tell you about the UPS, which is the US Postal Service, the USPS, I think it is. Socialists will try to paint that as something successful. It's anything but, folk. It's a disaster. Anybody who understands, I don't even live there, and I can tell you that they were literally taking, mail and just dumping it. Right? That's literally what they were doing. It was like Royal Mail all over again. It really was. It's actually covered. I know this because it's actually covered by Bob Murphy in his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. It's I'll need to read over it again. Maybe I'll even provide the argument that he made on that in particular, because I think I like to at least give such a mention for where I learned it from. He says, at the same time, workers no longer get a living wage. Well, this again goes back to the thing on inflation. The inflation keeps wiping it out. And why does inflation keep wiping it out? Because of his smart idea of thinking that running the printing press is the solution to things. He says, you think that's good for the economy when workers can't actually afford to buy much? Well, what do you think you're doing by running the printing press and devaluing the purchasing power of the currency? Honest to God, folk. These, they are so embarrassingly economically illiterate to the point that they really are like the dog that chases its own tail round in circles. So he supports running the printing press and then complains about the soaring costs of goods and services and why people cannot afford to buy things. It's like everything's back to front with these people. They just, honest to God, folk, they're so amusing. It really is. It's laughable. He says, so now I have to give up more of my, what does he say, pensions to pay for privatised internet. Well, that's all thanks to his social security, his big welfare state, you know, all the so-called free services, like things like the free at the point of use, NHS, etc. You know, all of these things, even the free prescriptions, the free education, the free tuition fees to university, etc. All of these things, and even a tax rate that's probably greater than 45% to probably greater than 50%. What the hell do you expect? I mean, how do these people expect people to be able to afford to get by in life if they imposed a social security system on them when they couldn't afford it to begin with? And the only way they could pay for the social security was basically through running the printing press. Basically driving inflation up. This is exactly what I mean. They're like the dog that chases its own tail round in circles. They've got no concept of economics. So he goes on and he says about about he can't afford to privatise services. Well, that's because it's not truly private. It's because it's not a free market. It's because the private sector is restricted. Again, he contradicted himself, because if you restrict the productive output, the costs go up. Well, who do you think's responsible for restricting the private sector? The government and all of its regulation. Honest to God, folk. And he goes on and he basically says workers are earning less money. Again, it's to do with the inflation. So he says, so you've got these billionaire parasites gouging both of the workers and the consumers. Again, he uses these words he doesn't even understand. And he says, and this is what you support and argue for. No, that is not what my friend was arguing for. My friend does not argue, and by the way, it was, this friend of mine came across my channel a good, few years ago. I think it was back in 2014, on the build up to the Scottish independence referendum. I did a video response on Tommy Sheridan or something like that. It was on something, I think it was in response on Radical Independence Campaign. Some people might even remember it. And she came across my video and learned from that, and then she went on to study economics herself to an extent, and basically she understands, right? She understands about prices, and this individual that's been completely arrogant to her, right? Being completely arrogant on the entire thing, and basically saying that this is what she argues for. Well, of course, she's arguing in favour of capitalism, because this person, just like all the other critics of capitalism, they basically try to pass capitalism off as what you're living under today, and you're not. It's a corporatist system. It's all their socialist government interventionism that's created the problems, just like the inflation, etc. It's like I say, they create a problem themselves, such as, for example, running the printing press, and then they say, oh, look what capitalism caused. This is why these people are the most ignorant-minded people you could ever come across in your life. They've never studied economics. You can tell that for a fact. You know it for a fact. It's not even debatable. He says, that's your idea of freedom. Well, actually, freedom is to do with the liberty of you having the choice of what you pay for and having the freedom over your own money, rather than having the government stick a gun to your head and then threaten you with violence and then tax you, which taxation is theft. But that's a whole other story, and I'm not even going to go into that. But the point being is the fact that, yes, capitalism is liberty. There is no such thing as having an economy that is anti-capitalist and having liberty. In other words, anybody who thinks they can live in the absence of capitalism and have liberty at the same time are delusional. It's not how the real world works. Capitalism is not some ideology. It just happens to be that capitalism is a framework, a system that pertains to the individual, and it's a system that's devised that is the only workable system that correlates to individuals being able to own their own possessions. Just as a quick example, you have your private property rights because that's there as an important thing to define what you own. Therefore, if somebody tries to steal something that you own, you can take them to court. That's an example of capitalism being required in order for you to have liberty, because you have the liberty to buy your own possessions and own what you own, but you need the private property rights there to protect that. Again, that's relation to capitalism. You can't have liberty without capitalism. It's a contradiction. And capitalism is defined around that of the free market. Says that's your idea of free markets. Well, again, has baseless claims, and that's all his argument's really been about. He says that's your idea of economics. Well, actually, yeah. He says, don't think I know what I'm talking about. Well, he doesn't. And he says, yeah, you're like someone running around constantly screaming that slavery is freedom. Now, this is, and I had actually a very, very similar argument, and it was a recent post I got earlier on today, and it was on my, one of my videos or something like that. I think it was in response a notification I got on YouTube. And this particular individual went on to try and, use the usual word slavery. You cannot for the life of you redefine the word slavery just to suit your own agenda, right? And in fact, that is an insult to people who are genuine slaves, right? Genuine slaves that had ball and chains around their ankles and were tied up in all sorts and beaten, right? Genuine slaves. Which is quite funny to say the least, because socialists love to use that constantly. And the funny thing about that is, these are the same socialists who pretend to be too goody two shoes and pretend to, pretend to be on the side of black people for their history and stuff like that. Oh, the poor black people, and they were slaves and all the rest of this. Oh, the evil white man. The game that the socialists play at. That game. Yeah. The evil white man. Everything is white supremacy and all the rest of this. And you've seen it with the Black Lives Matter and everything. And all sorts. You understand the point that I'm getting at. The point being is the fact that they're so contradictory on everything in that front. But yeah. It's running around screaming that slavery is freedom, and it's just like, it's that word slavery. They think that somehow you agreeing to work for a company is slavery, even although you go through an application process, you have to go through a job interview process. How the hell did they even call that slavery? I do not know. That is honestly how much the education system has failed these people. Be damned, folk. Slavery was like what you saw of people being captured and forced to do whatever it was, just like those who were forced to fight in the Roman Colosseum. Forced to fight to the death. The ruling class is literally something equivalent to the flat earth. More like his views are actually more equivalent to that of the flat earth society and all the rest of this nonsense. So what else do we have? I don't know if it was is this the fourth one? Again, I'll just quickly go through it. It says, dear, if you take a basic... This one's classic, right? You'll love this one. This one's absolutely brilliant, folk. Right? Get this. He says, dear, if you... And this is the patronising one, right? These people are so arrogant. So arrogant. It's, he says, dear, if you take a basic business course, one of the first things you'll learn is that profits are maximised by keeping business expenses as low as possible. Again, that's ignoring business reputation, right? Yes, a business has to a business will try to maximise their profits by minimising their costs. That also means that they're going to use fewer resources, and therefore, in order for them to maximise their profits and minimise their costs, they have to be more efficient. And in order to be more efficient, they have to also have a good business reputation that's going to have continual consumers coming back to their company and buying their goods, etc. So in order for them to even reach such a position of, maximising the profits to begin with, again, they have to provide quality service. They have to have a good reputation. But what he completely ignores and, cuts out the equation as if it doesn't exist, is that you have competition again. And if you've got competition, and if you've got a competitive labour market, and if you've got competition for skilled labour, then of course the opposite happens to what he's claiming. He's claiming as if it's something flat and fixed, as if they can just pay out whatever the hell they like and it will just remain that way. But that isn't how the real world works, because as you saw during the Industrial Revolution, wages were going up. That's all you need to understand. It's a complete contradiction of all the shite that these people speak. That's it, folk. They never provide you any historical examples. This is typical of a socialist or any mixed economy sympathiser. They just make baseless claims, they pull it out of thin air, and they hope that the shit that they spout sticks. That's all they ever do. It's the same type of people who say, oh well, if you support privatisation of the NHS, you only support healthcare affordable for the rich. Who said that? Nobody did. They did. They told themselves that. Well, that's exactly what these people are like. So, it's just laughable, folk. He says, keep business as low as possible. He says, expenses approach zero. Profits approach their maximum. But how can you maintain a balance between supply and demand if workers only have 25% of the necessary purchasing power to maintain jobs through consumption? Through consumption, well, it's simple, because just like the United States of America, there was the increase of the purchasing power of the monetary supply, and basically through a deflationary period, the consumer price index, the greater level of productive output, therefore the price of everything was dropping and wages were going up, the competitive skilled labour market. You see what I mean? These people just simplify things. In fact, they try to overly simplify things, shall I say. It says, you see there's a ceiling limit to how much wealth you can extract. That's not wealth. Like I said earlier, wages is not wealth from labour. Before workers can't buy anything. Well, if you're speaking about, buying anything, then yes, that is the wealth. But, people can buy more if they're going through deflation. And the market eventually corrects itself when businesses go under through deflation, etc. And how businesses survive during deflation is through that of, just like how Rockefeller did, it's through efficiency, through economies of scale, etc. And he says, how do you circumvent? So he says, you see there's a ceiling limit to how much wealth you can extract from labour before workers can't buy anything. So how do you circumvent the natural ceiling limit? Fractional reserve banking. It's unbelievable that he would even come out with that. The fractional reserve banking is a big part of the corrupt problem that we've got today, and it has been for decades, for more than a century period. All that fractional reserve banking, the printing, borrowing and spending and loaning out in high interest, etc. And basically shafting people right, left and centre. They've been doing that through the manipulation of interest rates, etc. and changing the reserve ratios, and they've shafted people through all the cheap loans, etc. and put people so far into debt through the fractional reserve banking that they try to call stimulating the economy. This is where the mixed economy comes into the mixed economy sympathiser, the Keynesian. They try to say that they're printing, their fractional reserve banking. They're trying to say that stimulating the economy through the central banks is how you actually make things better. Well, no. That's precisely what caused the booms and busts. They're pump priming. Pump priming basically means that they artificially lowered the interest rates below the market value, created the boom, and the eventual bust would follow, and I explained that before. And he says, which basically is borrowing for the future, says you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. Well, that's the thing, because he isn't stating facts. That's the type of arrogance that you do come across. What was the fifth one? I'm just trying to get through as quickly as possible. He says this is what your support. Scroll down. I think this was one of the earlier posts, in fact. It's just like capitalism is human life's management system. Yeah, it's just utter nonsense. He doesn't understand. I have to now pay 5 times money for internet. Then that's all to do with the internet again. I'm not going to go through that because I've already thingied up. I'm just going through the ones that I might have, whether I have covered it or not. If workers put $1 million worth of product into circulation, if the jobs are dependent upon those products being consumed, what happens if they only have $100,000 worth of purchasing power? See, capitalism is a pyramid scheme. I don't know where he gets that from. He says, literally have to bake a loaf in order to afford a slice. It's all nonsense. It's rather quite funny he says that, because in capitalism, in terms of the bread, it's there waiting for you in all variety of different options. Your shop shelves are filled with them. You've got all the different kinds, whereas with socialism, you'll be left in long waiting lines. That's quite amusing. He says, yeah, you have individuals such as Bill Gates now owning most of the farmland in the United States. Well, these problems have been created through the absence of a free market. The government's giving special interest favours and all sorts. What the bloody hell does he expect? It's government's in bed with the corporations, etc. This is exactly what I mean. He's trying to pass off this corporatist system as capitalism, and then pretends that that's what the free market is. They do that on purpose, by the way. It's all about trying to further their agenda. Farmland in the United States, he says, labs where people get the blood tested in Canada, the Canadian railway system, parking lots of hospitals, etc. Hundreds of millions of dollars that used to go to the workers are now going to people like Bill Gates and landlords. Again, they don't really understand to do with that of the role of the chief executive officers, etc., and why they get so much money and stuff like that. They think that these people just do nothing. I'm not the biggest fan of, Bill Gates, but I have a lot of respect for what he created in terms of Microsoft and stuff, and people continue to benefit from that, company to this very day. They benefit from the what was it, the operating system and stuff like that. He created wealth for so many people, and people like him can't even see that. They only see things one way, right? Socialists only see things one way. They only see where the money goes. They don't see the thing in the opposite direction, right? They don't see the thing that the person is buying. They don't see the product. It's just like when they talk about Bill Gates, they see where the money goes, but they don't see the operating system and the millions of people that have, in fact, billions of people that have got the operating system. You see what I mean? So this is typical of these people. How can you reduce the purchasing power of workers by hundreds of millions of dollars and not expect the blah 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 blah? See what else is, because it's nearly gone through these. I think, was that the one I just thingied? Yeah. I don't think I've got much left in. There's only like 3 left, I think. I'll just quickly go through this. I have to now to pay for. Want to privatise the health. This is great. This. When I pay for electricity, I'm only paying for the infrastructure, the machines, the workers, the labour, etc. And here you actually want to privatise the healthcare system. Yeah, damn right. Because a free market would not be faced with the economic calculation problem and all the rest of it. And these are the type of people who always bring up about the main American healthcare market. I've not read past that, by the way. I haven't read this comment before, so this is the first time I'm reading this, right, about this, the healthcare system. Now, past the word system there, I have not read, right? See if he mentions anything about the main American healthcare market. I don't know. He might do. He might. Who knows? He says, you think that is going to make things cheaper? That's like saying you want to put a giant hole in your boat to make it more buoyant. Well, given the very fact that the main American healthcare market has been given or shown up by a more free market model called direct primary care, then actually yes. And funny enough, there's a private sector in both of them. So, how does he work that logic out then? How does he respond to that? If direct primary care costs 80 to 95% cheaper than the main American healthcare market, and it's, all these private providers, how does he work that logic out then? Because after all, they're all private companies. So why aren't they expensive? Why is the main American healthcare market with the private sector about 49% or 51%? You know, why is that expensive? By that logic, then, direct primary care that's 80 to 95% cheaper, it would also be expensive then. And they're all private companies, and that's been running since 2005, I think, or 2010. So it's been running for at least 12 years, direct primary care. So by his logic, 12 years on, you would think that, well, it would also be expensive because it's got a private sector by that logic. You see how stupid these people are and how ignorant they are? They don't understand basic economics. They just think, oh well, you just privatise it and therefore it goes, the price goes up. What's that got to do with it? What is something being privately run got to do with the price of something? Nothing. Price is determined through the laws of supply and demand. And, you know, my friend must have been laughing at him for that. Because he's so clueless about basic economics, it's laughable. I mean, how can you not even understand something that basic? What's private ownership got to do with it? Nothing. Not a single damn thing. It's to do with the laws of supply and demand. And again, I don't need to go into it, but just quickly, just very briefly, the American Medical Association monopoly, where they closed down, you know, an estimated 123 medical schools, resulting in a shortage of medical staff available on the market, and the US population over the course of that century-long period increased by 284%. So if the US population booms by 284%, it means demand for medical treatment is going to soar through the roof. And since you've got a shortage of medical staff, then of course the supply and demand argument, again, relative to prices, that's why price goes up. What's that got to do with it being private? Nothing. Not a single thing. Is a problem created by government. These people have never touched an economics textbook in their life, and you know it for a fact. It's just they're so blatantly ignorant. It's just unreal. Let's read on what he says, because I don't know if he has said anything about American healthcare. He says, that's like saying you want to put a giant hole in your boat to make it more buoyant. Yeah, that's a brilliant. Giving control over the resources, employment, consumer goods to a small, rich minority. Well, by that logic then, John Davis and Rockefeller would have, driven the prices up. After all, he held 90% share of the market. So why did the price continue on dropping then? These people are a laughing stock. And it's important to note that, like I stated before, John Davis and Rockefeller held 90% of the market by 1885. But before the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, the same year before his company was broken up, he only held 62% share of the market. So in other words, his market share dropped from 90% to 62% naturally. In other words, competition stepped in like it always does. He was never a monopolist, like they claim he was. It's just as typical of these people. They make baseless claims and then they hope that the shit that they spout sticks, because their agenda is just basically to try and discredit capitalism. That's all it is. They're not interested in facts. They don't care about reason. They're not actually interested in reality. It's all about a feeling for socialism. That's it. So that's really all it is. That's what it boils down to. They don't care. Giving control over resources and employing consumers' goods to a small rich minority, that's the opposite of freedom. Actually, it's not. Freedom is giving people, anybody, the liberty to own what they want, the liberty to become rich, the liberty to run business, etc. That is liberty. He says, I shouldn't need to explain this to you. And when I mentioned these, and I think, I don't know if I'll check the remaining two just to see whether there is. Because again, these are not in order, folk. That's why the conversation does appear kind of broke. That's why in order to have a real economy, you have to base the earnings, not simply owning for a living. Capitalism is about owning for a living. And what he's basically trying to say here, he's trying to say that capitalism's all about just simply owning and that's it, and not producing. He thinks that capitalists do nothing. These people are they're just... Who the hell do they think came up with the idea of such technological innovation? The people who created the business. It's just... honest to God, folk, and it's his explanation in particular is just so irrational. You know, the funny thing is what he's basically describing here basically describes, partly describes socialism, being a leech. It says capitalism is about owning for a living, not working for a living. Every time you have a dollar that goes to someone who didn't work for it, someone else. You have someone who works for a dollar that they didn't get. It was basically describing socialism. Fucking this is what's laughable. These people. Capitalism is the economic system of parasites. Right wing produces pro-capitalist propaganda because they don't they don't want to work for a living. He's basically describing socialism. He's a fucking idiot. And he says they want to own for a living. He wants to capture and control as much of the wealth produced by labour as possible. As I mentioned before, where I live, we want the lowest hydro rate in the world. So yeah, that's on to the finals image screenshot. Okay, so he says, and when I mention these very, very simple and basic facts, you get all upset like a well-trained slave in defence of their master and masters of freedom. You're not a libertarian, I am a libertarian. Alright, he's one of these, screwballs who thinks socialism can correlate to liberty. No wonder he's so clueless. That's just... these people are amusing. The recent argument I had, though, was something correlative to an argument. It was on my YouTube, and what someone said, I'm not going to go into it, but it's a very similar argument on stuff to do with, businesses apparently can just do whatever the hell they like if it wasn't for government's regulation. At least that person had some, I'm not saying he's right, of course not, but he would at least have some argument where this particular individual, you can see is just, it really is embarrassingly ignorant, embarrassingly economically illiterate, and how patronising of him to turn around and say something in particular like that. Because there's nothing, and I don't need to go into that, folk. There's nothing there to show for socialism relative to liberty. If you take away the individual's rights, you're basically taking away private property rights. And if you have no private property rights, you've got nothing there to clearly outline and define what you own in personal possessions. And if you cannot own your own personal possessions, you do not have a liberty. And that doesn't just pertain to owning your own private land or private business. That pertains to personal possessions In other words, that's why you have private property rights. If you've got no private individual property rights, you basically can't own anything, because the reality is you would end up with chaos. You would end up with theft and all sorts. But in the real world, in order to prevent and organise and prohibit all that chaos, that's where the centralisation of power comes into it. And that's why in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Chaz, within the space of 2 weeks, they were already organising to have their own prison system and all sorts. They were quickly centralising to create their own form of government. They're that stupid. These people really are embarrassingly stupid. They're beyond the pale. So, I think I've gone on long enough on that in particular, but it really is amusing for them to even call themselves anything of the sort, which they're anything but. So let's see what interesting comments we've got here in particular. As you say, do you know of a YouTuber called TikTok Tick History? If not, I highly recommend him. Yeah, I mean, I'm more than aware of him. He was the one that did the very long 4-hour video on things. As you said, what we have is just socialism strangling capitalism after death, and a lot of people believing a lie. Yep, that's absolutely spot on. That's basically it. That's it in a nutshell. It's basically all the heavy government intervention, socialism strangling capitalism after death, and it's led to this corporatist system. As you say, hey man, been wondering where you were. Yeah, I've been meaning to get more videos out, and I'm definitely going to be doing so. I've also got a live feed coming this Saturday, because something just recently has happened relative to do with China. So I'm obviously doing a live stream with my friend Mike again, and he's obviously going to go through whatever that is in particular. I think it'll be about an hour long. So it will be 9 o'clock, I think, this Saturday. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to get more, because I've been intending to get more videos out. So yes, no worries about that. As you said, for all the communists talk about capitalist exploitation, communists sure love exploiting people a lot. Precisely. Exactly. Yeah, that's precisely it. Tick supports the Austrian School of Economics, doesn't he? I'm not entirely sure. I've not actually looked into too many of his videos in particular, but I do remember watching, some of the video that he did on the Nazi Germany, and I'm amazed how that video isn't blocked or nothing, because my particular video was, blocked and deleted, and it had half and half likes to dislikes. It had 75 likes and 75 dislikes. It was deleted because, it was offensive. It was just pointing out quotes and pointing out facts that are truth. So it's just typical, isn't it? As you say, Stepaniki, as you say, hey Scotty, I love your videos, keep them up. Thank you very much, I greatly appreciate that. I will get more videos out to you guys, don't worry about it. Did it just hit a point of marginal returns? Well, I'm not entirely sure what that would have been in response to, because that might have been at an earlier comment, I think. Dexter, as you say, once you have a regulation, you just need to respect the regulation to not be sued. Well, that's one thing for sure. I mean, you can talk about, particular regulation, but the thing is with the regulations, and I don't think it's such a a bad thing that you have low levels of government regulation, and if there's something that's absolutely reasonable or whatever, and if if it's one of these things. But these people don't look at economics like that. These people don't realise that economics is a study of analysing not just the short-term given effects of policies, but the long-term given effects of policies, and it's analysing whether it has a positive impact on people or not. And that is what you should measure, regulations down to. The problem in your economy today is the fact that you've got, so much costly, unnecessary regulations, that becomes such a greater cost on smaller businesses, that comes such a greater cost on the economy, and it also hinders, opportunity in the marketplace. So you've got, fewer opportunity, and therefore that's what's led to, soaring private sector costs, etc., because it's restricting the private sector, it's restricting competition, it's restricting innovation, it's strangling the market half to death. I mean, that's basically it. But what you'll typically find is the most successful economies that have all had extremely low levels of government regulation. Sweden between 1870 to 1960 proved it. Hong Kong between 1950 to 1997 proved it. Singapore proved it for, decades, right up to this very date. Unfortunately, I think in the last year or two, I think it's starting to, move in the opposite direction. That's a whole other story, but you get the point. As you say, once you have... Yeah, I think I read that, didn't I? I think regulation only started when the regulatory body was created. Not in particular, but that is such the what you're speaking about in particular, right? Throughout the 19th century, right up to that period, there was low levels of government regulation. So in other words, the market was left be to strongly regulate itself, in particular relative to that of the safety of the workplace. It was the government regulatory body that imposed all the heavy government regulation over the safety of the workplace, and it ended up leading to stagnation. And it's beyond... The evidence is clear. The government's regulation did not help. It made things worse. Which is exactly the point that I was addressing. Supply and demand. Old tales never dies. Yeah. As you ask, so should government intervention be used to help punish the exploitation? That's a reasonable, question that you ask. Well, that's the thing. I mean, why do you need a government for that? Because at the end of the day, I mean, think about it this way. If you've got competition, why can't that individual just leave the company and go and work for someone else? That's life. You're going to get particular companies that try to exploit their workers, and they're not going to benefit themselves in that regard. In fact, they'll gain a poor reputation as a result of it. That's what will happen to them, because workers will go away and spread bad word. It's just like what's happening with Amazon. It's bad word spreads, and that's it. And the difference is with that of a free market economy is the fierce competition and plentiful employment opportunity. It's not like that in today's economy, where, what have you got outside of that? Well, opportunities few and far between. That's why, in today's economy, they're getting away with doing so much. Let's take, for example, the mass foreign immigration, and they're giving these people, cheap labour and therefore it's driving wages down and stuff like that, right? I'm sure you're aware of that. The point being is the fact that they're getting away with, at a greater extent to such a level, they're getting away with this because the market itself is restricted because of government. So why would you want government to get involved? It's the government's restriction on the market that's escalated the problem. Because now there are fewer jobs and there are far greater quantity of labour chasing the same jobs. So these businesses know that they can easily pay someone off and simply replace them because there's a large quantity in demand for those jobs. They're not going to care. That's why exploitation is at a far greater extent today in today's economy than it has ever been. And what created that problem? Government's intervention in the economy. So it wouldn't make any sense for government to step in and intervene in the market where such a thing exists. Why not just allow the individual the freedom to simply leave the company that may do so, and give them the liberty in a free and open market to go and work for someone else who will pay better? It's just that simple. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying that things are going to be, unicorns and rainbows and all the rest of this nonsense. That's not what I'm saying. But if you were to contrast a free market to that of the economy you're living under today, capitalism wins hands down, tied behind its back. That's the point. As you say, but the issue was the non-competitive practices, not the price of oil, right? The non-competitive practices. See, here's the thing, right? And I'm just going to briefly explain this. The myth of the robber barons is one of the greatest lies that's ever been told in recorded history. And there's no greater figure to illustrate that than John Davis and Rockefeller. It is one of the biggest lies that's ever been told that John Davis and Rockefeller apparently did unfair things and did things that wiped his competition out, and he was responsible for it, and that he was this evil, monopolist who shafted the consumers and used predatory pricing, which basically means to slightly reduce your prices below your competition, then drive your prices up and shaft the consumer, etc., etc. Well, we know that predatory pricing never happened. And we also know that from recorded history, there's never been a monopoly to ever stem from predatory pricing. So, Ron Chernow, a historian who wrote about Rockefeller, who made that baseless claim and said that he used predatory pricing, was just talking piffle. The Mises Institute crushed his argument through that of illustrating the consumer price index. I mean, so the point being is the fact that he never used unfair practices. The reason for why the hundreds of other oil refinery companies were going out of business wasn't because Rockefeller did something unfair to them. It was because they were inefficient. It's because he was that every bit smarter than the rest of them. He could see around the corners that they couldn't. He was one of the most intelligent business people that's ever existed. I'm not just saying that. He really was. If you actually studied John Davis and Rockefeller, he was one of the smartest people you could ever know. A very, very smart businessman. And so, because he was an accountant by trade, he was utterly obsessed with efficiency. He was obsessed with it. How's that non-competitive? That's not non-competitive. All that is just someone who's obsessed with efficiency. And why is that a crime? It's not a crime. So the success of Standard Oil didn't come because, he did something awful to other people and it was so unfair. It kind of reminds me of that story of the 1970s where they say, he unfairly gained rebates. That's a lie. That is a lie. In fact, I think it was it Cornelius Vanderbilt? Whoever it was that ran the industry at that time, he basically offered the most efficient competitor a rebate because the fact that the greater your efficiency is, the more you will benefit his business. Do you understand? So that's why, I'm sure it was Cornelius Vanderbilt, but basically that's why in the railroad industry, which we call railways, that's why he was giving a rebate to John Davis and Rockefeller, because he could justify it because of Rockefeller's efficiency. In other words, he was willing to give a rebate to any company that was that efficient. It wasn't just something where, they got behind closed doors and they shook hands and it was like, there's all this evil corruption that took place. There's nothing to do with evil corruption. All it was simply a case that the other competitors were so inefficient, and Rockefeller was he was far ahead of his competition in the oil refinery market in terms of his intelligence, in terms of his efficiency. And there's stories that go into that. There's a guy in particular, an economist, who has even been on Great Britain News, and he's even done talks on to do with the climate change and stuff like that. And he's of the Ayn Rand Institute, I think, and he's even gave an argument on the whole myth and gave examples and what Rockefeller did. Now, that's why Rockefeller became so successful, because he entered the market in 1863, and because of his utter obsession with efficiency, that means, let me give you a tiny small example. I think it was something like, one day he went down to one of his workers on the factory floor, and he saw one of his workers dropping 36, dropping solder or whatever it was to seal the cans or whatever, right? And he stops his worker and he asks him, how many drops did you use, right? And this is how obsessed with efficiency he was. He asked him, how many drops did you use? And he says, 36, right? And he says, okay, well, why are you using 36? Try 38 drops, right? I mean, you're probably thinking to yourself, what's 38 drops or that? It's nothing really, is it? It's nothing. It was something like that anyway. I can't remember the exact figure. It was something like that figure anyway, right? So he says, try this other figure. I'm sure it was like 38 or something like that. And it turned out when he came back the next day that it was slightly just over. It was leaking from that. So then he says slightly leaking the cans or whatever. So then he says to him, okay then, instead of 38 drops, try 37 drops. So just from one, just taking away one drop, right? Just from that obsession of efficiency over, so much, over so much, he was saving as a result of that. That efficiency is why he was saving so much money. Whereas these other oil refinery companies were taking 40% of their crude oil and they were just dumping it. They were just dumping it. That's all they were doing. They were just taking 40% crude oil and just dumping it. So what was capitalism doing? Capitalism was punishing the inefficient and it was rewarding the efficient. That's what capitalism's all about. Capitalism's all about rewarding efficiency and punishing inefficiency. Whereas the system you live under today rewards inefficiency and punishes efficiency. So, Rockefeller was basically a man who was way ahead of his competition. He was obsessed with efficiency. That's the reason why he was saving. A good example of this was, as a result of his efficiency, he was able to afford to buy his own forest. So he done so. And what did he do that for? Well, he bought his own forest so that he could then, get his workers to start producing his own barrels for containing the oil, right? Because they used to store it in these wine barrels, and the wine barrels would leak, and sometimes, if I remember right, and the other thing about the wine barrels was the producer of them would take time in order to produce them, and sometimes there was a period where the oil refinery companies couldn't get access to them, so there was a delayed time. So what did Rockefeller do? Not through some uncompetitive practice. All Rockefeller did was simply say, rightly out of his own money that he rightly saved and earned through his own efficiency, he bought his own forest, said to his workers, I want you to produce for me barrels that are cheaper and more efficient and better quality. Now, the wine barrels that these other companies would get would cost $3 a barrel, right? $3 a barrel it would cost them. Just for each barrel, and you tally that up over thousands and thousands of barrels of oil, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of money. As a result of what Rockefeller did, just from buying his own forest and simply getting his workers to go and produce some, better quality barrels for a cheaper price, take a guess by what amount he was able to reduce it by. Well, the answer is, he was able to produce each barrel for 96 cents. You think about that. A cost reduction of $3 a barrel down to 96 cents a barrel. 96 cents. He was making a massive saving from that alone. Never mind the savings he was making from the efficient thing I was explained about with the solder and the cans. That's why Rockefeller was becoming so successful. The reason why the other companies were not is because, first of all, they were dumping 40% of the crude oil, being so wasteful. Secondly, the other oil refinery companies, because when more and more competition, after all, there's no barrier to entry into the market, and because the oil refinery industry at that time in 1863 was such a profitable industry, because more and more competition in supply enters the oil refinery market, it means there's going to be a higher level of productive output. And since there's more competition flooding into the market and there's a higher level of productive output, it means the price of the barrel of oil is going to plummet. And that's what happened between 1863 to 1870. The cost of a barrel of oil dropped by 50%. Now you think, to all those companies who were being wasteful and inefficient and dumping 40% of their crude oil, what do you think it was going to affect them by seeing the price of a barrel of oil drop by 50%? Well, obviously it was going to decimate them. That's their own fault. How's that the fault of Rockefeller? It's not the fault of Rockefeller. It's not Rockefeller's fault for why they're so incompetent. And it's simple as that. Just from people not knowing economic history, just from something as simple as that, people misinterpret history and then, make things up as they go along and make up all scenarios, just complete bullshit about Rockefeller, and they say, he was just someone who used all unfair practices and stuff, and that's how he gained dominance. There's no truth to it. None. There is no truth. Yeah, the communist countries, you'll always get them. He's on Charlie all the time. You should make a comprehensive video on fascist economics. Well, that's the thing. I mean, fascism is something I've explained before in brief. It's not difficult to really explain. It's basically what you're seeing with corporatism. That's the economic element of fascism. Capitalism is just a system that describes human nature. We all depend on voluntary exchanges to survive. Absolutely. You're spot on with that, mate. You just want poor people to be poor. How dare you support them keeping more of their own money? Yeah. Glorious. Under capitalism, one guy can end up with a really big amount of money. It's the power in the way persons. So I'm just quickly going through. There's obviously comments that I might have missed out. There's all the arguments that support the failed USSR while the capitalist West enjoyed so much prosperity, East and West Germany being a good case study. You can argue that to an extent, even although the United States was dominated in that time period by corporatism, but even still, if you were to compare the Soviet Union to the United States, then yes, definitely. There's absolutely no question of that. Milton Friedman wanted the government just to only consist of defence and law. Another thing I forget, would your government be similar? Well, yeah, I mean that's it. I mean I agree with that. I obviously don't support the central banking system, and I would support free market money in banking. But a government, that's limited, small, that would really only be held there for, limited things like the defence, etc. and I've still to get around to at some point reading more into the privatization of the roads and stuff like that. Walter Block makes a fantastic argument on his case, on how they can certainly go around and achieve that in particular, setting their own rules. I can understand his argument. That's a whole other story. As you said, if Rockefeller got ahead by scamming everyone in a still developing field, let's see some evidence for such bold claim. Yeah, you're always going to get claims about Rockefeller, and that's it. Did I read that end bit of your comment? Fellow libertarian here. Right, I see. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things, mate. It's yep. So I do agree with Milton Friedman on a lot. Thank you, mate. I do greatly appreciate it. It's always greatly appreciated, pal. So I will, obviously, you guys, I will get more content uploaded and stuff like that. I thought, well, I may as well do a live stream today, since I've not done one in a wee bit. And this Saturday, 9 at night, 9 o'clock at night, it's supposed to be arranged Saturday. I'll be doing a live stream with Mike, of course, whatever my next video will be. But yeah, I mean, I thought I would respond on that particular argument and stuff like that. And it's like I say, I mean, just the recent argument I had today wasn't that particular argument that my friend had, but the recent argument I had today, someone trying to claim again the usual, that capitalism results in monopolies and all the rest of this nonsense. Folk, these people just make things up as they go along. They really do, because they have no examples to show in history where a monopoly stemmed as a result of predatory pricing. None. The only way a monopoly can stem is by restricting the productive output. That's it. That's the only way. And because I'll quickly, if I can find it for you guys. The only way that you can do so is by restricting the productive output. That's essentially it. And I'll just quickly get to that quote in particular. Oh, it's also important to note this. Like I said before, they say that there was in relation to that, they say that there was a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, and yet between 1840 to 1900, the division of income remained the same, exactly the same. So there was no dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. The division of all income remained the same, with 70% going to the workers and 30% going to the capital and resource suppliers. It remained the same all the way from 1840 right up to 1900, which flies right in the face of the utter nonsense about that of the myth of the robber barons. The common narrative that you hear that apparently Rockefeller etc. held a monopoly when he never. But I'm going to find the comment. Here it is. And this one's quite important. This one actually correlates to exactly what I'm saying. So this one, and I've provided this particular comment in videos before, whether you've heard of it or not. On quote. This is by Thomas J. DiLorenzo, by the way, in How Capitalism Saved America. As Tom DiLorenzo goes on to say, I surveyed the congressional record for 1889 and 1890 to compile a list of industries that were accused during the Sherman Act debates of being monopolies. Data that go that far back are sketchy and incomplete, but I acquired price and output data for 17 such industries. The results were startling. While real inflation adjusted gross national product increased by approximately 24% from 1880 to 1890, those industries that were allegedly restricting output actually increased production in that period by 175%. On average. For example, steel production rose 258%, zinc 156%, coal 153%, steel rails 142%, petroleum 79%, and sugar 75%. In other words, in the decade preceding passage of the Sherman Act, those industries targeted as monopolies grew at 7 times the rate of the economy as a whole. So, really, it was just a lie. The entire thing was a lie. The whole claim that antitrust law legislation was brought in apparently all to protect the consumer, to protect you from so-called evil monopolies that weren't monopolies at all. In other words, they basically shafted you. The real rationale behind the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was not to break up supposed monopolies. It was brought in to impose the McKinley tariff, which was nearly a 50% tariff. Right? It was basically protection. It was corporatist. So you see all those socialists out there who were supporting the government getting involved in supposedly all in the name of, breaking up these supposed monopolies. They were supporting corporatism all along. So yeah, folk. I just thought I would put all that information out there for you guys. It's just one of these things that, you're always going to get these type of folk. Like I say, I'm going to get down to, looking at whatever I'm going to do next. Especially my next video, and I'll get that out to you guys. Whatever that may be in particular. Obviously, I greatly appreciate all you guys. Thank you for all your comments and that. As you say, DN, hello Scott, could you do a research on workers' cooperatives? What is your opinion on workers' co-ops? Many socialists try to sell this idea as an alternative to capitalism. What is your opinion? The answer in a nutshell is that such a thing could not exist without a capitalist system, and that's it. How can you operate an economy without the laws of supply and demand? You can't. How could you operate, an economy without free-flowing, fluctuating prices in the marketplace? You can't. And that's what capitalism's all about. Capitalism's about leaving the market be to freely regulate itself. It's about the free market. So when you're speaking about leaving the market be, and when you're speaking about a market in general, what is a market by definition? A market is a place where there are buyers and sellers, and there are individuals involved in that. That's why a market economy is capitalism. A market economy is capitalist. So, the reason why a market has got nothing to do with socialism, and you'll hear these people try to, relabel socialism as market socialism, but it's really just a desperate attempt to try and pull socialism away from its disastrous failure, to try and relabel socialism to something that they think can work, and it doesn't. But in a nutshell, from what you're going on about with the worker co-ops, the reality is you need prices, and you need you need a market with prices to exist, so that you know what resources you're going to use, where you're going to allocate them, by how much, and you need to know all that information. You need to know the most efficient methods of production. You can't operate an economy without prices. And so any of these workers' co-ops that they go on about, any of them that have existed, only existed within the structure where capitalism was present in a mixed economy. For example, Spain, where they keep going on about this Mondragon, etc. The reality is, these workers' co-ops, or the likes of John Lewis as an example, they only exist because it's within a system where capitalism's present to some extent within a mixed economy. It's technically a corporatist system because of the mixed economy. However, the point being is that to some extent there is the limited capitalism where you have in retail companies price fluctuation. Prices being freely left be to freely flow and fluctuate. And this is the thing, because when it comes to socialists, they do not accept that. The reason why socialists do not accept free-flowing, fluctuating prices is because in the real world of economics, you have scarcity, and if you end up with a shortage, the price soars. And how often have you seen socialists react in some sort of way to higher prices where they try to control the price and artificially lower it? You see it all the time. That's why socialists are always arguing for rent controls. It's why they're always arguing for, all these other controls. Because socialists are control freaks when it comes to the economy. They think an economy is something that you can just play God with. So they think it's just a case that you can just simply take a price and artificially raise or lower it above or below market value. They think that it's just a case that you can simply just control everything. And that's not how an economy works. And therefore, they would be faced with the economic calculation problem if they were to try and get rid of capitalism. Therefore, you're not going to have prices. So if you're not going to have prices, how then are you going to solve the problem with scarcity? Because the purpose of a higher price isn't just for the sake of knowing what consumers' demand is and what to produce more of, etc. A higher price also allows you to ration what's scarce. Yeah, that's the reality of how things are. I mean, these people who think they could just operate an economy without, profits and losses, they would be doomed from the get-go. All socialism is. It's totalitarian. You could never have socialism without a government, and the government being the central planner of the economy. It's what defines it. Right? Socialism without a government is just a myth. It doesn't exist. It could never exist. That's why in anarchist Catalonia it was never anarchist. Immediately when there was anarchy, it immediately descended into a reign of terror. And it ended up being the committees They ended up immediately creating their own form and acting as a government. And what they did was they let out prisoners, and basically gave criminals special privileged positions to then terrorise innocent people into their way of, how things should be. Even their so-called Ukraine Free Territory was never free. It was a military dictatorship. I mean, in every instance, even the Paris Commune was the exact same thing, where they started terrorising private company owners. This is just, it's how socialists are. They don't have an understanding of the real world of socialism. That it's never going to escape government. So their argument of workers' co-ops, the only way such a thing could exist is within the framework of a capitalist system. That's it. Otherwise, they're screwed. I mean, how can they have that, without capitalism? It's impossible. I mean, they're the type of people who think they can operate the economy without profits and losses. As you say, they want to help Jimmy by robbing Jane. Exactly. It's funny reading that, because that's honestly the truth. That's essentially everything of what socialism's about. Everything about socialism is all about, thieving from someone else. I've got nothing against, see if someone, see if a group of people wanted to create something like a workers' co-op, and there'd be no company owner, and it was within a free market economy, in other words, a capitalist system. What's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that in particular. Is it guaranteed to work? Not necessarily, but that's another point that should be addressed. Capitalism does not guarantee you success. So yes, capitalism is basically a system that you're going to have failure within the private sector. That's not a sign of a capitalist system failing, and this is what people who support the mixed economy and people who support socialism wrongly think. They think that just because there's these private companies that are failing, therefore that means privatization's a failure. No, it means here's private companies that are a failure. This is a sign of the capitalist system working, because the capitalist system punishes failure, leaves it to liquidate, and allows it for newer, more efficient industry to come through. That's how it goes. But that's not the system you're living under today. Like I said, the system you have is corporatism, in other words, cronyism, and they basically prop failure up. Kind of like how they kept on bailing out the banks. The bad banks, they kept bailing them out. No different to other things. Other failure, they keep on propping up the NHS. That's corporatism to a T. It's propping up incompetency. It's propping up pish. It's propping up inefficient shite. And basically rewards it through taxpayers' money. In other words, regardless of how bad it gets, it's constantly rewarded. It's a bit like if you've got a dog, and a dog is, badly behaving itself, and you give it treats for that, you're rewarding it for poor behaviour. You're rewarding it for incompetency. Well, that's exactly what they're doing in this, economy today, as a result of the absence of capitalism. That's no way to run an economy. Because all you're doing is you're basically encouraging incompetency, for a start. Because they then think to themselves, oh well, I don't need to worry about losses, it's the taxpayers going to pay for it all. The other reason being is because of the fact that they then get into the attitude of thinking, oh, I got one subsidy, so I'll probably get another later down the line. It doesn't matter how I run business. We're no longer faced with risks. In other words, they're no longer faced with the risk of losses. Being faced with the risk of losses is important because it's what puts or holds your feet to the fire. It's what ensures that you're going to be efficient. And if you're not, you're punished for it. And therefore, you learn your lesson. It doesn't mean the end of you, however. But the point being is the fact that it's important to reward success and punish failure and have that risk involved of facing losses, because then you're more likely to see businesses operate efficiently, and that's the thing. And that's the point. When you look at these state-run services like the NHS, or take for example the government-run fire department in the United States of America. There was 50-story high buildings in 1911, and yet the government-run fire department, their ladders could only reach between the 6th and 7th floors. When the Ash building caught fire in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the fire started on the 8th floor. So when the government-run fire department showed up, not only did they show up late, their ladders were too few, and their ladders were inadequate. Their ladders could only reach between the 6th and 7th floors. The fire started on the 8th floor. and you know what the funny thing is? Even in 1911 there was 50-story high buildings. So what's the point? Well, fast forward to 2001, when Trade Center building number 7 collapsed due to a fire. Right? Fast forward to that time period. Did you know that there's a private truck company that produces engines where their ladders can reach between the 30th and 33rd floors? Yet the government-run fire department today in the United States, their ladders can only reach the 8th floor. That's right, in a century-long period, they've only increased between the 6th and 7th floors up to the 8th floor. And a large part of that would probably have been down to government safety regulations. And people have the audacity to sit there and say to you, oh, wherever would we be if it wasn't for our government-run fire department? It's just amusing. It really is a comedy show. Government is so incompetent. Because let's face it, what's government got to concern itself over? It just simply takes your money. It's got no risk. There's no risk involved of any losses, is there? Where's the risk involved of government making any losses? There isn't. The government has no risk. There's no risk involved. Because the government simply takes your money that you worked for, that it didn't work for. That's it. That's why your state-run services are so incompetent. Because they're subsidised. They're guaranteed funding. That's why hundreds of private companies in the late 19th century, in fact throughout the 19th century in the United States of America, hundreds of private companies who took on government subsidies were all going bankrupt. Meanwhile, those like Cornelius Vanderbilt and James J. Hill who refused to take on government subsidies, they were doing quite well, thank you. Why? Because James J. Hill and Cornelius Vanderbilt were simply running their business modestly and were faced with the reality that they could potentially face losses. Whereas, the likes of Edward Collins and his steamships, his business, he was incompetent because he knew that every time he would go back a year later, he was being guaranteed a large sum of money as a subsidy. That's the truth of the matter. That's why he was so incompetent, because it was just money in his pocket, it was money in his hand. It was like, it's a bit like the Northern Pacific Railroad Company in 1860s, I think it was 1863, I think it was round about the same time period. I can't remember specifically, it was round about that time period. What I do know, however, the specific year that they did face bankruptcy was in 1873. The Northern Pacific Railroad Company would build 2 railroads through, I think it was like the West or something like that. And basically, the Northern Pacific Railroad Company took on a government subsidy. The government, in other words, was offering rail grants. It was offering a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track that they would build. So in other words, the government was offering, these rail companies $48,000 if you're going over the top of the hills and stuff like that. And what it basically meant was that it's basically like saying, don't worry about efficiency. It's basically like saying, don't worry about anything. For every 1 mile of track that you build, regardless of how you build it, we're guaranteeing you a large sum of money. So in other words, efficiency takes a back seat. Efficiency goes out the window. Which is the very reason why the Northern Pacific Railroad Company ended up taking long routes around the Rockies, and essentially, started taking, things that would bump the cost up. In other words, just to get more money out of it. And in the end, before they could even open the railways that they had built, there was damages. I think they built over the top of, if it was icy land or something like that, I can't specifically remember. It was going to cost them a lot of money in repairs. So they turned to Congress. They asked for a large subsidy. I think it was like $50,000 or something like that. And Congress basically said, go do one. Go stick that right up you. Get to. And that's essentially what Congress said. And that's why in 1873 the Northern Pacific Railroad Company faced bankruptcy. In other words, it's the same story with, government-run services, the public sector, like the NHS, etc. Why would they be concerned about how to run it? Why would they be concerned about, such inefficiency? It's guaranteed funding, irrespective of how it operates. It's like the NHS, regardless of how many years has gone by of its disastrous failure, they just keep bailing it out. It really is a laughing stock. You see that in the quote, workers can elect democratically the business they work. How this would be bad. This is how this would be bad and not as good as a capitalist company. There's no guarantee. It's like I said, there's no guarantee that they can, say a company will be successful or not. Democracy in private business, it will hurt efficiency in the end. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things. You need a system that basically rewards failure and punishes success. Yeah, unfortunately, Australia's. Well, it's the same here. It's the same here, mate. As you say, Labour policy, government owning your home. Yeah. An argument against my road is that maybe we have too much. In terms of too much, I mean, you look at all the potholes in the roads. That's one thing you can definitely see. It's typical of government funded roads and stuff. Was it US business borrow more money from bank because of government increasing regulations and taxes? Yep, that's always the case with what happens. Australia heading to communism. It's since the lockdowns and stuff like that, it has become more and more authoritarian. I've certainly seen that. I don't know if you quite go down the road of that, but it's one of these things. You are definitely seeing the authoritarianism. Well, if Johnson ticked out and get someone like Jeremy Corbyn, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean, mate. As you said, in response, imagine how you would run a company with 4 years from which you benefit. In scenario 1, why not steal from as much as you can for passing the ruins to your enemy? I can pretty much understand. Yeah, it's so yeah, I hope that kind of explains the issue. You need a system that rewards success and punishes failure, and it's why you need a capitalist system, and a workers' co-op could work. It could work, but that's the same for any business. You understand? In other words, the only way a business is going to work is if you leave prices be and you leave consumers to determine what gets produced. Capitalism. That's it. So they're not really. They can't really make up a system of workers' co-ops without capitalism. It's impossible. And their socialism. Well, I've stated before, there is no such thing as libertarian socialism. Sit in a nutshell, folk. I don't know if let me check because I don't know about the Facebook comments and stuff like that. Probably not. But anyway, I'm probably going to go and get something to eat. Because I've been on long enough. I've covered mostly what I wanted today anyway. Whether I shortened in the argument or that, who knows. In terms of the video. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously been a pleasure, and obviously, like I say, I'm going to get round to doing more videos. Don't worry about that, guys. Yep. And so, obviously, been a pleasure, and I hope you guys have a good day in that. And yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do for the rest of the day. Nonetheless, I've just been doing a lot of studying and what have you. Obviously stuff from my photography and other things, it's just one of these things. But I'm going to get more videos out for you guys. No doubt I'll do confined videos on what I've spoken about. Who knows? I'll get more response videos out for sure. Righty, and I shall obviously talk to you guys later on. That's basically it. Thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.